Good morning. A number of years ago, I was walking in Yerushalayim, Makar Baruch neighborhood. That's, for those familiar, that's right around where the Mayanot Yeshiva is. And I happened upon a Jew, whose name I do not know, but he is one of the owners of Girsa. Girsa is a bookstore, a foreign store in that neighborhood. And I asked him, he probably at that time knew me by face. I would frequent the store somewhat regularly. And I asked him, do you have a copy of Hilchos Medina? And he right away went quiet, and he looked around and made sure nobody was looking. I kid you not. And he said to me, come by the store tomorrow, and I'll have it for you. I walked into the store the next day, and he sees me, gives me a nod, and he pulls out from under his desk, the cashier's desk. The book was already wrapped in a plastic bag, so nobody should see the contraband. And I paid him, and he gave it to me, and I made my way out safely undetected. So what was this book that was such a dangerous transaction to be taking place in such a Haredi neighborhood in Jerusalem? So there was a very prominent Talmud Chacham Pesach in our generation by the name of Rabbi Eliyahu Waldenberg, the author of many volumes of Shalos Tshuvas Tzitz Eliezer. One of his very famous psakim is for being somewhat lenient, at least in compared to other poskim, with regards to abortion. But he was a very prominent posek who authored thousands of tshuvas, and passed away at a very ripe old age, over 100. He passed away, I forget exactly when, but after the year 2000 for sure. And he wrote a book called Hilchos Medina, the laws of the state. Laws that pertain to Eretz Yisrael under the current state of Israel. He published that book in the early years of the state, in the 50s, in the 50s or 60s, and posthumously it was republished. However, when it was republished, it became very sensitive, shall we say, because as the polarization of the different communities in Israel, it became sort of out of bounds in the Haredi community to give any legitimacy to the modern state of Israel, and to engage and to suggest that perhaps there is halachic significance or Torah significance to the state vis-a-vis many laws, some of which we'll touch upon today. And so it was kind of banned for this book to have been reprinted or to be sold, and that's why it was with such a degree of secrecy that the owner of Girsa agreed to sell me this banned book. And hence, the moral of the story is, if you want to make some money, make sure your book gets put in Cherem, and that way you'll make lots of money. So,
note to Slifkin.
Yeah, exactly. So, we've discussed in previous weeks the status of Gaza and that whole region of the land of Israel. We discussed how it certainly is included in the land that's the promised land to our forefathers. We discussed that both in the time period of Eilei Mitzrayim, which includes from the time when Joshua goes into the land all the way past till the end of the kingdom of Judah, when they were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar to Bavel, so including the lands incorporated by David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, that's all called the period of Eilei Mitzrayim. And then we have the period of Eilei Ezra, of Eilei Bavel, of Ezra, the second Jewish kingdom in the land. Here.
Just one?
Yeah. And that extends. Well, that is some debate. We'll touch upon this soon, but there's some debate as to how long that extends. Does the halachic status of Oili Bavel extend even to those areas which were conquered by, and here's the Hanukkah connection, by the Chashmonaim. And we saw that, whichever way you slice it, it's clear that that section of Eretz Yisrael did not ever have long-term, unchallenged Jewish sovereignty and Jewish settlement in either of those two periods. There were times that the Jews settled there. There were times that the Jews had proper sovereignty there. Sometimes they had sovereignty, but they were just collecting taxes from the Gentiles who lived there. But because of all of these complications, or because of all of this not smooth history and trajectory, that region of the land does not have a simple solution. It's not clear, is it considered part of the land of Israel? Well, it depends. We might say that when it comes to the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, it does, but when it comes to having to do the tithes, it does not. Or when it comes to the tumah of Eretz Amim, the impurity of the foreign nations, it does not have tumah. But perhaps when it comes to the mitzvah of challah, it does have that status. And as we've seen in the past, there are many different opinions and many different statuses and sort of subdivisions of status that region could have. Throughout the years, post even in our current Galus, there have been times when there was Jewish settlement in that region. There was, I believe, post-Spanish expulsion, there was for quite a while a Jewish settlement there, and there were some very famous Jewish characters who lived there. I think we could probably say most famously, or infamously in a way, is Nosson HaAzasi, is the prophet of Shabtai Tzvi. He came from Gaza. He was Nosson HaAzasi, and then also famously Rabbi Yisrael Najara, who I believe is most famous in our circles for being the author of the Zemer from Friday night of Kor Riboin. His son, and his grandson were all Rabbonim in Gaza, and in fact, until just a few decades ago, there was a known burial site for Rabbi Yisrael Najara in Gaza. That Jewish settlement basically faded into oblivion somewhere in the 1950s, I believe. There was of course, we're all familiar with more recently, brief Jewish. There was a Jewish community there.
And others?
Yeah, no, it wasn't primarily Jewish. There were others also.
During that time,
Who else was living there besides the Jews? I don't know exactly. I assume there were Arabs there also. And then more recently, we're probably all a little bit more familiar with what we generally know as Gush Katif, but basically that was 3 Jewish settlements on the coast of Gaza, in the north, center, middle, and south of Gaza, which ended with the so-called Hitznatkut in 2005, I believe. But what we want to talk about is halachically. We're not here to study history, we're here to study Torah and halacha. So, does modern day Israel occupying or annexing a given section of land have halachic ramifications vis-a-vis mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz, the mitzvahs that apply to the land of Israel, the sanctity of Israel, etc. So, as you can imagine, based on our introduction, that if we want to go to the sources about this, we're going to have to look to the contemporary sources about this. We're going to be looking more towards rabbis with at least somewhat of a Zionist slant, because those who have a more Haredi approach, they're not really going to be open to the suggestion that the contemporary state of Israel should have, that the decisions of the contemporary state of Israel should have any halachic ramifications, which is a little bit frustrating. I did see a tshuva briefly from, I think it's from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, yeah, where he is actually, it's in the context of whether or not a lot have to keep 2 days of Yom Tov, which, a big part of the question, which is whether or not 2 days of Yom Tov depends on being in Israel or not, or maybe it just depends on its proximity to Israel. The Chabad community in Eilat does do 2 days of Yom Tov, but that's a topic for another discussion. But in that shuvah, I saw that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman basically adopts the approach that the state of Israel has no ramifications, and in fact, he even seems to adopt the approach, which we'll mention soon, that even the Hashmonai kings who expanded the territory of Israel has no halachic bearing either. So, just a moment. So we're going to get more silence from there. On the other hand, the more Zionist approach to things. So, if you're looking at, for example, the tshuvas from Rav Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of the army and later became the chief rabbi of Israel, under certainly a lot of controversy. But in his tshuvas on this topic, Rav Shlomo Goren was a huge Talmud Chacham and a very brilliant man. But it's very also clear that he has a strong agenda to promote the status of the land of Israel and the decisions that the contemporary state have on that. So in his tshuvas, it's very.
He's very much a Zionist.
Yeah, he's very Zionist, and he's and his halachic decisions are clearly influenced by that. That's not a criticism. That's just the way that's the truth of all halachic decisions are in some way influenced by the person's hashkafic mindset. So two articles of tshuvas that I want to look at briefly today, which are to some degree or another middle of the road in terms of their, they are certainly Zionists on some level, but also accepted in the Haredi circles. So one is a brief article from Rav Zevin. Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin, was actually a Chabad Chassid who came to Eretz Yisrael. He was a Kopister from the Kopister line of Chabad, certainly had strong Zionistic leanings. Brilliant Talmud Chacham, perhaps most famous for his groundbreaking work of the Encyclopedia Talmudis and many others. So he wrote an article.
Talmud Chacham, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So he wrote an article about this in anticipation of the 1948 Declaration of Independence, and he was musing about what halachic ramifications this might have, and of course the exact territory that was going to be included in the state of Israel was I'm not sure exactly when he penned this article, but that obviously, there was different stages in those discussions. And then a tshuva from the Tzitz Eliezer, author of Hilchos Medina, which we started out the class with, which he penned after the 1967 Six-Day War, when the Israeli army had then conquered huge territories, including, most relevant to our discussion, including Gaza, and even including parts of the Sinai Peninsula, which were not part, if you're going south of Wadi al-Arish, if we're assuming, as we've done in the past, that Wadi al-Arish is the southwestern tip of Israel, so the Sinai Peninsula extends farther than that, so they're even conquering land which is not included in the territory of the Promised Land. So what ramifications is there to that? And of course, part of the discussion is, does it make a difference if they occupy it or only if they annex it, which of course played a big role, because at that stage, post-1967, Gaza and Sinai was occupied by the Israeli army. Later they retreated from Sinai, and in 2005 eventually even retreated from Gaza, and they've still today have not annexed Gaza, versus other sections of the land, such as the Golan Heights and in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which at least certain parts of it have been annexed. And what is the status of all of those?
But are you saying that annexing would have possibly a halachic?
Well, that's the question. That's what we're discussing.
Because, what more are you actually doing in terms of chazaka when you're doing an annexation, right?
Right. So there's really three. Really, we could probably say there's three steps. One is the war. You're conquering land, and within that we also have to discussed, well, what is the nature of this war? In halacha, there's milchemes reshus and milchemes mitzvah. Milchemes reshus means that the Jewish king decides, okay, I want to go and conquer this land right now to broaden our territory. Milchemes mitzvah could mean in l'chayra one of two things, generally speaking, either as part of the mitzvah of conquering the land of the seven nations, which, for example, the Ramban, which we saw last week, in his Shikha Sa'esed Mitzvah Sasei Dalet, says that there is a positive mitzvah to conquer and inhabit the entire territory delineated in Parshas Masei, in Bamidbar chapter 34, which certainly doesn't include Sinai, but certainly includes Gaza, as we saw last week. And so that's step one, war, conquering. Then you have chazaka, which means living there, right? So you could say that Gush Katif was a chazaka because there were areas where the Jewish people were chazaka. And then there's the question of annexing. There's annexing, which is just a declaration on paper. What ramifications does that have? But let's go back to the pasuk. So we already saw last week in Parshas Masei, there's the borders of Israel, which is the mitzvah to conquer, have been enumerated. But then there's other psukim which seem to suggest much broader territory. And if you look on your source sheet, right at the top, we have the pasuk from Parshas Eikev, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 24. And we'll ask Rabbi Rossman to read it for us.
In English?
That's up to you.
This is at
The top of the page, right at the top of the page.
Every place upon which the soles of your feet will tread will be yours. From the desert in the Lebanon, from the river, the Euphrates River, and until the western sea will be your boundary.
So suddenly in Parshas Eikev, we have Moshe Rabbeinu telling the Jewish people, first of all, that every place where which your soles of your feet will tread will be yours, and then it says from the Euphrates River till the western sea. So that's a much bigger border, l'chayra, than we saw in Parshas Masei, from the river to the sea. There we go. Yeah,
They just didn't understand what that really meant.
right. So what's going on over here? Is it the boundaries in Parshas Masei, or is it from the river to the sea? Right. Which one is it? So we already alluded last week. We saw we had last week the Abarbanel, the Ramban, the Netziv. But here I've put only in the Hebrew, unfortunately, the Sifri from Parshas Eikev, where he explains what this means. And Ari, would you read the Sifri and translate, please?
Really?
Go for it.
All of it?
Well, just this paragraph. Yeah, it's not.
Okay.
Maybe just the first half. We'll see.
All the places that your feet walk on. If you're talking about the borders of the land of Eretz Yisrael, it already said from the Midbar Halvanon. So what does it mean then? We've already said that just this, wherever you go, so these borders. So that what's the point of saying all the places that your feet go? So that's in order to tell you that any place that you've conquered, besides these places, those are also yours. Rishos biyadchem lekavesh chutza le'eretz Yisrael. So, it's in your permission.
That's like rhetorically. Or is it within your permission?
Or is it within your permission to conquer land, to chutza le'eretz, to outside the land? Ad shelo yikavshu eretz Yisrael. That until before, right? So, would it be permitted for you to conquer land that's outside of Eretz Yisrael? V'yirashtem goyim gedolim v'atzumim mikem. That you will inherit. V'yirashtem goyim gedolim v'atzumim mikem. That you will inherit many great nations amongst you. And then afterwards it says every place that your feet tread. On it. Shalotea Eretz Yisrael mitamem beglulim, that Eretz Yisrael shouldn't be profaned,
With idolatry.
Impurity, with idolatry, v'tem chozrim, and then you will return with mekabshin, and then come back and conquer it. Chutzalar from outside Eretz Yisrael. Ela mishati kivshu Eretz Yisrael to rashayim lekavish chutzalar.
Do 2 more lines.
Harei shekivshu b'chutzalar. Behold, if you've conquered outside of Eretz Yisrael, minayin shamitzos nogos. How do you know that the mitzvos that you practice sham over there are tadan?
Okay, so to summarize, what is Sifri telling us? Sifri is telling us that the way we have to understand these seemingly contradictory psukim is that there's a territory of Eretz Yisrael, and as we saw Rashi last week, the territory of Eretz Yisrael and Pashas Masi is to tell you that this is the area in which the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz apply. Once you've taken care of that, once you've conquered that land, then you may go and conquer further territory and apply. That would apply the kedushas haaretz. That would apply the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz to that territory as well. But only provided that you have first conquered the entire territory that's in Pashas Masei. And that's why he goes on to say that David HaMelech conquered north parts of Syria, but that doesn't count because he did that before he had finished conquering the south, the kingdom, the area of Judah, of Yehuda. There were still parts of Yerushalayim, it says, right? Samach Yerushalayim, close to Yerushalayim. So, in other words, the way Chazal are understanding these psukim is that we do have the authority to expand Eretz Yisrael, not just for us to live, but even to expand it, and that the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, that the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz would apply in that expanded territory, but provided that it's done after we've already conquered the land of Israel itself.
And the reason being that if we conquer outside of Eretz Yisrael before we conquer within Eretz Yisrael, it gives an opportunity for those nations that are within to cause all kinds of havoc within Eretz Yisrael boundaries.
Right.
Even that expanded border that's within these larger borders,
Oh, so then the question is, well, can we go further than that? That's what you're asking? Yeah, so the Sifri doesn't discuss that befeirush, but the other Mefarshim do that. What we saw last week a little bit, certainly the Netziv does. L'chayra not. I don't know. There's also within the Sifri doesn't get into such detail here, but the other Mefarshim that we saw last week do get into a little bit more detail as to that there's only the way the Netziv understands it is that there's authority to conquer even more up to a certain section, and then that's it. And then the rest, beyond that, is only when Mashiach comes, which, as we discussed in the past, that's when we get the land of Keni Knizu Kadmoni. So, for example, that land of Keni Knizu Kadmoni, we're not allowed to conquer before Mashiach comes, according to many at least.
And and this answers the question that the pasuk implies that, well, all these areas, and then it's also saying kol makom every place that your feet tread.
And so there's three things. There's any place that your feet tread, but then it said only a certain area, and even that certain area is much bigger than the area in Parshas Masei.
Okay.
So there's really three. So that's why the Netziv sort of breaks this down into three, where you have Parshas Masei is the main thing, then there's authority to do more, but then the absolute or sort of limitless authority is only when Mashiach comes. That's the way the Netziv
What land is
understands it.
that?
Keni Knizu Kadmoni?
Of what you're talking about.
The Keni Knizu Kadmoni?
Yeah.
So we discussed in the past that there's different opinions if it's southeast or northeast of Israel.
But that's much bigger.
Yeah,
That's much bigger.
Yeah.
And then there's even the possibility of even greater than that, and that's any place that you go.
Well,
Any place that you
there's the
conquer,
famous Chazal, which we usually understand more in hashkafic or in spiritual terms, that Hasidah Eretz Yisrael shetispashet b'chol ha'arotzis, that Eretz Yisrael will in the future expand into the whole world. So does that, whatever usually we understand that to mean in some sort of, that when Mashiach comes, the whole world will have some sort of degree of sanctity that it doesn't have now. Whether that means has any halachic bearing, I'm not sure.
Right. I mean, I know a lot of people ask about whether there'll be enough space for all Jews to come into Eretz Yisrael. Like the size that Eretz Yisrael is right now, not so much, right?
Right, but certainly once you incorporate Keni Knizu Kadmoni,
Then it's a lot more space.
yeah.
The entire Jordan, or Saudi Arabia, maybe all of Lebanon. We should take Lebanon now.
You know,
Yeah.
when I first read
There's a lot of
this-
people in Lebanon, all right. Sorry, guys.
When I first read this,
South.
my thoughts were, this is exactly what the Muslims believe. This is what I've read. If their feet has tread on this land, conquered it or whatever, for any amount of time, it's theirs forever. I mean, that was my first thought when I read. That's why we have this issue here, you know?
100%.
Kind of an agreement is just an interim agreement, that's all it is. Until
Right.
one side gets stronger, it's usually the other side that we have this problem. So,
We see that war or conquering land through that means is a valid aspect of ownership, right?
that's how,
Whenever-
I mean,
Both sides are looking
and
at
every
this.
side looks at it that
that's
way.
correct.
But
And it's
uh,
forever. It's like, you know,
So the thing
Well,
is,
these
gotta
days-
live there for thousands
These
of
days,
years.
most people who want to talk smack about the reality of that are okay only with their own version of that.
Right,
Everyone
that's
wants to stop the acceptance of conquering and holding territory when they were done with conquering and holding their territory. Now we stop, right?
I mean, the interesting thing is that all the other religions agree that the Jewish people are the chosen nation. They just believe that we stopped being the chosen nation when Muhammad or Yashka came to, you know,
Right.
you know. But one point that pertains to this discussion, which Eliyahu sort of just touched upon, is that what's a Milchemes Mitzvah? So before I said Milchemes Mitzvah means when you're doing the mitzvah of wiping out the 7 nations, but there's another category of Milchemes Mitzvah, which is when you do it when the enemy starts up with you. So by responding, for the Jewish people to start a war, Milchemes Rishus has to be with the king and the permission of the prophet and the Urim V'Tumim, so you can't just decide, okay, you know, I'm going to go to war right now. But once it was brought onto us by the enemy, and now we have a Milchemes Mitzvah to respond to that, so now now that's sort of, Hashem orchestrated that, and now this is the mitzvah that we have to do, and have this Milchama, which is, in the case of the 1967 war, for example, that was a big part of what the Tzitz Eliezer is going to be is talking about. Is like this was a Milchemes Mitzvah, which was brought upon us, and then suddenly in the look back, we're like, hey, we have now all this new territory that was conquered by Milchemes Mitzvah. What is the status of these territories?
Right. So, but this is according to the Sifri, areas that we would conquer through a Milchemes Rishus outside of the
So
territory.
the Sifri doesn't get into that. That's what we have to.
No, but he does. Doesn't he say that based on this limud of Yihiyeh and Yihiyeh that it would have the same status when it comes to mitzvahs? No.
Yes, but exactly what stipulations need to be in place for that to work? What exactly? All the Sifri really says is that it is possible to extend the territory of the mitzvahs, but which steps exactly need to take place in order for that to be extended? So, as you could imagine, there are many opinions, but we're going to at least get a snapshot of it from looking at the Rambam, and I'm going to ask Rabbi Eliyahu to read the Rambam for us. You have it there. So actually, there's a number of relevant Rambams, but the one I put on the page is from Hilchos Trumas, Perek Aleph, Halacha, Beis, and Gimel, and it's there in English on the bottom of the first page, going on to the second page. Yeah.
Wherever Eretz Israel is mentioned, the intent is the lands conquered by the king of Israel or a prophet with the consent of the entire Jewish people. This is called a conquest of the community. If, however, an individual Jew, a family, or tribe go and conquer a place for themselves, even in the land given to Abraham, it is not considered as Eretz Israel in the sense that one is obligated to observe all the mitzvot there. For this reason, Joshua and his court divided the entire land of Israel into tribal portions, even though it was not conquered entirely at that time. In this way, when every tribe would ascend and conquer its portion, it would not be considered as merely an individual conquest.
Okay, so the Rambam is saying that in order to apply Kedushas Haaretz, again, here we're talking in the laws of Truma, so vis-a-vis tithes, it has to be, first of all, it has to be conquered by the community, Kibush Rabim, and he also says it has to be, in the beginning he says conquered by a king of Israel, so that could be one discussion. Do we actually need to have a monarch in order for this to work?
How's that possible? There was no kings until later on.
During the times of the Shoftim, he's asking.
Well, hold on, one second. Or, okay, so first of all, or a prophet, okay? He says clearly, king or a prophet, with the consent of the entire Jewish people. So we need a king or a prophet, we need the consent of the entire Jewish people, those are basically the two main stipulations the Rambam mentions here. He does not mention, this is an important diuk, which I believe Rav Kook makes a big deal out of this diuk, is that he doesn't mention Bezdin. Elsewhere, he does mention Bezdin. I don't have my photo of me, but in Hilchas Melachim, the Rambam brings, let me see if I have it here. In Hilchas Melachim, the Rambam does mention over there the requirement of a Bezdin, and Rav Kook wants to say that the reason over there is because in Hilchas Melachim he's talking about, one second. In Hilchas Melachim he's talking about a voluntary Milchemes Reshus, a voluntary war. And for Milchemes Reshus to have the validity, it must be done by the authority of the Bezdin as well. Whereas here in Hilchos Trumas, where we're talking about within the promised land, so it's within the area that there's a mitzvah to conquer, so then you would not need the Bezdin. So of course, that might play a role in saying, well, when it comes to, let's say Gaza, you don't need a Bezdin, but for the Sinai Peninsula you do need a Bezdin. That could be a possible ramification of that diuk from Rav Kook.
The settlements in the West Bank would be affected by this idea, right?
So the settlement in the West Bank is l'chayra a little bit more simple than Gaza, and the reason is because the Gaza never had, as we discussed last week, clear-cut kedushas haaretz, right? For some things it did, for some things it didn't. And the reason is, as we discussed last week, because it was never properly, in a long-term way, under Jewish conquest and monarchy, and right. But the areas of the West Bank, that was part of Kedushas Oile Bavel, and the Rambam says, and we saw this Rambam a few weeks ago, that the areas that were sanctified by Ezra remain holy for eternity. So, from that respect, you could say that what happens in 1967 to the West Bank is irrelevant. The question is, does what happens in 1967 to Gaza expand on Ezra? That's the question.
So it's not even disputed territory, the West Bank.
As far as I understand, yeah.
I'm using that word.
Oh, yeah.
I like this.
I don't even know what anybody's talking about.
Okay, you know what? You might as well read Halacha Gimel as well. Go on.
The lands which
Wait, so again, with the Rav Kook's diuk, what's
Rav Kook's diuk is that here in Hilchos Trumas the Rambam doesn't say anything about Bezdin, whereas in Hilchos Melachim he does.
okay? So what's
But the context of the Hilchos Melachim is a voluntary war. A king who decides, I want to expand my territory. So there, it's a Milchemes Reshus, you need to have Bezdin. Whereas by a Milchemes Mitzvah, you don't need to have a Bezdin. And that's why from there, the Tzitz Eliezer is going to say that, okay, so now that 1967 was a Milchemes Mitzvah, because they came and then we have a Mitzvah to defend ourselves, so now we don't need, even in absence of a Sanhedrin, of a Jewish high court system, we could expand the territory.
even if there were areas that were beyond what we're defending, right? Well, that's also within the boundaries, right?
But that's not the point. It doesn't matter. The point is, if it's a Milchemes Mitzvah, it doesn't matter which boundary it's in, right? Once it's a Milchemes Mitzvah, if you go there and you can,
No. And there's two things here. There's the West Bank, which is within Oile Bavel. You have Gaza, which is outside of Oile Bavel, but we're still within the Promised Land, and still within not just the Promised Land to Avraham and Yitzchak, but even the land which we have a mitzvah to conquer in Pashas Maseh. And then you have the Sinai Peninsula, which is nothing. It's just it might as well have been Uganda. Yeah, but
right. No,
but either way, we're saying that once any territory, even if the Gaza had been like the Sinai, right? Once they attack us from Gaza, we have an obligation.
Right.
To,
so that
the question is okay. We'll hopefully get a chance to see this. But the question is,
even Sinai could be parts of Eretz Yisrael now as a result of this, because they attacked us first and then we fought back. Meaning Gaza is the areas that.
Well, the question.
Even if we
We're getting ahead of ourselves because we have this.
Gaza we can initiate because Gaza is still within the areas that we're supposed to be initiating those
We're getting
fights.
ahead of ourselves. Hopefully we'll have time to wrap this all up. But very good point. Okay, let's skip halacha gimel. Let's move on. You know what? Do the last halacha on the page is from Hilchos Asur Bia, Perek Chaf halacha gimel. Go on, Yosef. You read it.
The lands which King David.
I skipped the dramatic reader because he was drinking orange juice. But go on, Yosef. You read it.
Okay. The lands which King David conquered.
No, the next one. The last one on the page.
That one. This here?
Yeah.
In the present era?
Yeah.
In the present era, even in Eretz Yisrael, challah does not have the status of a scriptural commandment. This is derived from Numbers 15:18. When you come into the land, etc. Implied is when all of you entered, and not when only a portion entered. When Ezra ascended to Eretz Yisrael, the entire people did not ascend. Okay,
so again, this is talking about challah, and this would apply to Tumas and Maisis as well, but it would, for example, not necessarily apply to Shemitah. But the question over here, besides all the questions that we've discussed until now, there's another question which is going to be part of the equation over here is, how many Jews need to be living in Eretz Yisrael for any of this to work?
50%, right? 51%.
All right, let's see where we go. Okay, so first of all, I have here basically what I'm going to try to do in the time we have left is I have here two articles printed out. One is from Rav Zevin, which he penned in the lead up to 1948, and one is from the Tzitz Eliezer, which he penned in post 1967. The tshuva from the Tzitz Eliezer actually is a very, very, very lengthy tshuva. It's 101 sections. Obviously, I've just taken out a few little sections from it, but first let's go to Rav Zevin.
Did anybody? I'm sorry. Did anybody ever read the book The Chosen by Chaim Potok?
Of course.
What two sects of Judaism?
So, Rav Zevin, it's telling me here that my battery is low, so hopefully it lasts. Rav Zevin starts off over here by saying, well, according to the opinion, we've been until now going with the opinion that Oile Bavel extends forever. That's the opinion of the Rambam. He says, according to the opinion that Oile Bavel finished, that status of the lands finished by the Roman exile, so does the establishment of a Jewish state renew that? And he says, well, let's look at the Chashmonaim. The Chashmonaim, so he says, Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his Sefer Meruk Tzia, which we saw a big section of that Shuvah of the Meruk Tzia last week. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden assumes that whatever was conquered by the Chashmonaim does in fact effectuate Kedusha on the land. However, others, he quotes here the Tvus Haaretz, he disagrees with Rabbi Yaakov Emden and he says no, that only what was accomplished by Ezra and his generation effectuates Kedusha, not anything post that. By the way, a big part of the discussion over here, which we're not going to have so much time to get into the detail, but it's important to mention it, is that does there have to be a process of being Mekadosh? So you conquered it and you did all, but does there have to be sort of a formal ceremony of Kedusha? So Ezra was Mekadosh it. Ezra did a ceremony where he declared this land is now sanctified. So is that a necessary ingredient in being Mekadosh Aretz? And actually, Rav Shlomo Goren, in way before the 6-Day War, in 1950 something or other, where there was the Suez Canal, I think it was 57, he actually, in his position as the chief rabbi of the army, he went over there I'm not sure exactly where it was, in Gaza somewhere maybe, or in the Sinai, and he in the Sinai, and he did the ceremony of declaring this land Kaddish. Now, obviously, from the Zionist perspective, if you consider the contemporary state of Israel to be the part of that, to have the significance of just the significance of Ezra, so then maybe Rav Shlomo Goren has some authority to do that. But a more traditional approach would be or a more conservative approach would be that no, in order to make Kedusha says so, you need to have Ezra, you need to have the leader of the Jewish people, you need to have a Navi, you need to have Urim V'Tumim, you need to have, the things that we don't have until Mashiach comes in order for that ceremony to actually mean anything. So that's part of this discussion as well.
He did this. At Ezra?
No, they didn't have Urim V'Tumim, but they had Nevuah.
They didn't have Urim V'Tumim, so why would we need that?
Well, maybe it's just as valid, different. But he did this. Goren did this before 1967.
Yeah, he did.
So what is he? He's going in the middle of the Sinai. That's part of Egypt.
He's doing. They call it in Hebrew. They call it the Mivtza Kedesh. I forgot exactly what it's called in English, but
we had no control over those areas at that point.
They did. There was a brief period in the 50s where they did.
Is there anybody who actually?
Anyway, again, this is this is completely besides the point. It's not. We could easily get distracted by that. So says Rav Zevin that if you adopt the approach of the Tfuras Haaretz, that the kingdom of the Chashmonaim does not accomplish it, that is only Ezra. So he says, then what we're doing today is even less than what the Chashmonaim did. First of all, he says, the pasuk tells you Asher Yarsha Avisecha V'Yirishta, and the Gemara learns out from there that there's Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shniya. We don't have any biblical source for Kedusha Shlishis. So who says there's such a thing, B'chal? If you say, like Rabbi Yaakov Emden adopts, that Ezra means from Ezra and forever, okay, so then you could talk about whether what we're doing today means anything. But if you take the other approach, that Ezra means specific, the generation of Ezra, so then the Chashmonaim could still be considered, they're not the generation of Ezra, but it's the same kingdom, so it could be considered an extension of Ezra. But what we're doing today, there's no scriptural source for a Kedusha Shlishis in Chazal. When Mashiach comes, so it's fine. What?
Yeah, so then there is a Kedusha Shlishis, clearly, in times of Mashiach.
There doesn't. Is there a source in Chazal that would effectuate Kedusha vis-a-vis mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz? I'm not sure.
I mean, that would mean that forever, for the rest of time, Gaza, which was mapped out as part of the original Eretz Yisrael, is not.
No, because again, he's going to go with the point that when you have Mashiach, then you have a Navi, then you have Urim V'Tumim, then you have the possibility to create new things that you didn't have until now.
Okay, so it would be a Kedusha Shlishis that's substantiated for the first time.
Right, and then he goes on to say. So I mentioned this already. Yeah, that you need to have kedusha b'peh, and that for that you need to have Ezra or somebody on a stature, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, not just Rosh Shlomo Gar. Okay. Then he brings the Rambam that we just saw before from Milchus Asuri Bia, that you need to have all bias kulchem, all the Jewish people living in Israel. So he says that's not happening in 1948. Okay, there's a possibility that with time that will happen. He's looking forward optimistically to the future.
Not 50%. It has to be 100%.
Oh, 1 second. You're saying 50%. The Rambam says everyone. Now, then he says there's another machlokus really between Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, who are in some level contemporary to Rav Zevin, right? And certainly Rav Zalman Meltzer is, and then Reb Chaim Soloveitchik is is the teacher, the Rebbe of Rav Zalman. But basically, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik held in his commentary on the Rambam that the Bias Kulchem only helps if it happens together with Ezra. The fact that later on more people would come wouldn't make any difference. Meaning, the Rambam said, we just saw that Chala is only midrabanan because even when Ezra came, he didn't have Bias Kulchem. So what if 5 years later everyone would have come out of Bavel? Says no, it means you have to come together. So according to Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Chaim Brisker, even if now all the Jews would come to Eretz Yisrael, it wouldn't help. You need to have the Kedusha coming together with that. But Rabbi Zalman Meltzer and Rav Zevin is strongly in support of Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. He has a very good...
What's the Kedusha?
He has a very good raya also because he says that he brings a Rambam that says that the Rambam, that you could have a theory, a possibility of a chiyuv deraisa and Eretz Yisrael for Chala, even shaloi b'fnei abayis. So he says clearly that's not talking about the times of Ezra. Anyway, So say he says, okay, fine, let's adopt that you need to have bias kulchem. But then he says, okay, everyone. Does everyone mean most people or not? He says, I think so. Probably it means most, the majority, but he doesn't have a clear source for that. So Rav Zevin, I would summarize him as saying he's open to the idea, but he's far from convinced. He seems to be much more comfortable with saying that in order to actually effectuate any change, he says, he seems to be okay with saying you don't need everybody, you need Roiv, and cutting most of those corners. But the thing which the flavor I'm getting from reading his article is that you can't just have, Rav Goren. You need to have Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, a Navi, somebody of stature who clearly represents the entire spectrum of the Jewish people to come and effectuate this Kedusha. And in absence of that, it's not really going to make any difference. Again, he doesn't say it definitively. He's just writing here an article summarizing the possible approaches, but that seems to be the gist that you get from his article. Now,
what would be the nafkamina? Practically speaking, like in the immediate, if let's say you can't accomplish that right now, so what
you can or cannot?
You cannot, because you can't accomplish all those things, right? Because you don't have a Navi yet. Whatever,
yeah.
So let's say you somehow conquer Gaza, it's Hashem. What would be the status? Like what would be expected of us over there? Like the
most pressing.
Would it be
the
like
most
a
pressing
only or?
Well, most mitzvahs tluis ba'aretz are going to be derabanan anyway because you don't have Rav Yisrael Aleha.
Right,
although we'll see in a minute, Rav Waldenberg has another approach to that. But l'chayra, if I recall correctly from Rav Goren's Shuvas, he as far as he's concerned, the biggest issue is whether or not Shemitah applies.
That's what I was looking at.
Right. Okay. So what would you do?
Right. This is a very we think of this as sort of an abstract halachic and almost hashkafic question, but this is something which, and that's why I was saying that there's a bit of a. It's a shame that you don't have more Haredi, and at least I haven't seen more Haredi in-depth shuvas on this, because this is something that the Haredim have to deal with just as much. The Eidah Haredis of Yerushalayim, who are very anti-Zionist, when they take produce that grew in Gush Katif, do they take Trumas and Maestros and do they treat it as Shemitah or not? I don't know offhand the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's my question. That's what's bothering me.
Okay,
when they had the lettuce, we had it and stuff.
You're holding by Shemitah, then you're acknowledging.
You do it just.
By the way, a lot of the stuff in Gush Katif, for those who remember, grew in greenhouses, which in general downgrades the whole thing anyway to the Rabbanon. Right.
Even if it was Eretz Yisrael, full Eretz Yisrael, Kedusha's Eretz Yisrael. They did the hydroponic stuff, right?
I don't think it was all hydro. I don't remember the details. Anyway, now Rav Waldenberg, he writes this tshuva, which is very excited. B'chesed Hashem Aleinu, in Hashem's kindness with us and His great mercy, we have seen the return to Zion. Anyway, he's very busy with.
Since Eliezer saying all that.
Well, I'm translating loosely, I'll read for you a few lines in English. Chesed Hashem Aleinu v'rachmav ha'gedolim zochinu lachzis la'achrona ayin ba'ayin b'shuv Hashem tzion v'achzoretz ez nachlosi la'am kodshoi. Okay, and b'meila we have to now verify does the obligation of Trumas and Meiros apply to these new areas? And he divides it into three: Eilu Mitzrayim, Eilu Bavel, Sichin v'Oig. Okay, he has the whole thing. So he's writing this. It's a very, very lengthy tshuva. It's the first tshuva in volume 10 of his tshuvas. I believe he has a total of 17 or 18 volumes. And unlike others, he kept them all with the same name. You have Chavadas and Ravadi has a whole bunch. It's one. He has volume 1 through whatever. Okay, so. There is a sefer called Hilchas Eretz Yisrael, which is attributed to the Torah, and in Hilchas Eretz Yisrael, there seems to be a suggestion that basically, as soon as an individual or at least a community live in an area and are no longer under threat by some enemy, so then applies Kedushas Haaretz over there, and he says, how is this possible? How does this make sense with all the things we've been learning until now? And Rav Waldenberg basically, together with the person who's communicating with over here, they want to suggest and obviously he gets into different rayas from different gemaras, but he wants to suggest that basically we're used to thinking the way we've said from the Rambam is Oilim Mitzrayim come, they effectuate a certain kedusha, then Nebuchadnezzar takes them away, cancelled, done. Now you have Oilim Bavel is a new kedusha, but he's suggesting no, the kedusha of Oilim Mitzrayim remains there on some degree of potential. And that if ever in the future there is a Jew living in this area, or at least a Jewish community living in this area, that what was left in potential, sort of dormant, from Eile Mitzrayim, is enough for this little for this dwelling here right now to merge with that and together effectuate kedusha. And he says if we were to accept this, which Rav Waldenberg seems to be quite excited about this, then that gives tremendous opening to new areas being effectuated with Kedushas Eretz Yisrael from 1967, because you don't need a government, and you don't need a Novi, and you don't need a Malach, and you don't need anything, because as long as it's within for the Sinai Peninsula you would. But as long as something is within the Shatach of Oile Mitzrayim, that would be good enough according to this suggestion.
What is that based on, though?
Well, so he's basing it on the Torah, and he's basing it. He has other ayahs for it as well. Again, like I said, it's a very lengthy thing, so I'm just trying to give you some bullet points from this tshuva. Now, then he says, "What about? Okay, but fine, we are going to accept it. We're not going to accept this." He goes back. He goes round and round in circles. So then he says, "Okay, let's think some other things which we have to think about." He says, first of all, you need to have bias kulchem. And he comes up, I'm going to tell you a chiddush. And again, he tries to back it up, and he finds sources for it, that he says, not only do you not need everyone, and not only do you not even need roiv, the majority of the Jewish people, which you guys said 51%, but really you could maybe be 50% plus one, yeah? He says, actually, I have a much bigger chiddush. He wants to suggest that it's enough if there's 600,000. 600,000 Jews is considered bias kulchem, and if you accept this chiddush of Waldenberg, then we've got 600,000 there a long time ago already. Certainly by 1967 there were, I don't know the numbers in 1948, but certainly by 67 there was 600,000.
I don't know, according to whatever, between like 49 and 52 there were 600,000 Jewish immigrants to Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
I believe that's the number of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, he says, Ma Robsa Simchasi, how happy I was when I found that Hagoyin Mekutna Zechrona Levrocha B'Sifri Yisrois Malka. He says also this 600,000 thing. Okay, fine. Then he says, okay, the Rambam says you need a melech, you need a king. But first of all, he brings from Rav Kook, they all bring this, that Rav Kook suggests, and this is certainly something that it's a complicated halachic debate, but certainly that in the Zionist camp, I know Rav Hershel Schachter, for example, buys this lock, stock, and barrel, that the contemporary government, even though there isn't...
Can say Rosh Mishala is like known as the king?
He wouldn't say...
No.
Nobody's suggesting
makes
that...
a distinction.
No. He wouldn't say... Nobody, as far as I know, nobody's saying that the prime minister has the status of a king, vis-a-vis, he has a mitzvah to write a second Sefer Torah or anything like that. But what they do say is that the government, the body of the government, is a substitute for the body of the monarch in vis-a-vis things that you need the monarchy to effectuate, right? So again, nobody's saying that there's a mitzvah for now the king to write a second Sefer Torah, but in the fact that the Rambam says you need a king to conquer it and to make, in other words, the king is the one making unilateral decisions on behalf of the Jewish people to annex a certain territory, for example. So according to Rav Kook's approach, which Rav Waldenberg seems very happy to accept, if the government make that decision in a democratic process of governing, that would have the same status as a king making that decision.
And that's that's kind of like a svara, right?
Well, he doesn't get into it here. In Rav Kook's tshuva, he does try to bring rice for it. Look, if it's just misvara, it's a svara, it's a possibility. It's certainly not a svara that is muchachas, right? Sometimes you could have a svara that, okay, that makes sense, but it's not it's not a logical imperative to accept that svar. You could say no. Then the king means a king, and it has to be the process of Aaronic. And without Melech HaMashiach is a king. Yeah. So good, but he wants to accept that, and therefore that's how he gets around the issue with the Rambam. With the king. Anyway, then he goes on. He totally accepts the Rabbi Yaakov Emden that the king of Achashmonaim were able to effectuate. So that certainly gives him much more leeway to expand his horizons. And then he goes on to say, which what I said to you before, the diuk of Rav Kook about the Bezdin, that here, because it's a Milchamas Mitzvah, you don't even need a Bezdin, so we were forced into the Milchamas Mitzvah by the enemy attacking us, and therefore it becomes a Milchamas Mitzvah, and so we don't need a Bezdin, we don't need a Melech because we have the government, we don't need Kibbush Rabbim because we have 600,000, so fine, so we're good. So therefore, he is taking this approach. As I mentioned already earlier, Rav Goren also takes a very similar approach. Rav Goren comes at it from a completely different angle. I'm trying to remember how Rav Goren works. Rav Goren is much more, the flavor of his tshuva is much more Zionist. It's like the army and we've annexed this land, we're occupying this land, and it's all about what you have in mind and what you intend to do and where your heart. He gets, it's much more of where Rav Waldenberg's tshuva is the flavor of the tshuva is much more traditional halachic, and Rav Goren's tshuva he gets into details with the Rambam and what does the Rambam say and what does the Rambam mean and how does the Rambam fit with what he says in his commentary to the Mishnah. But the flavor of his article is much more sort of Zionist in the flavor. Let me just finish off over here that he says, what about the fact that you need to sanctify it? You need to have the verbal, like Rav Zevin wrote. You need to have Ezra came and sanctified it. So he says no. He says. Anything that, based on the Rambam, which we've discussed also a few weeks ago, that Kedusha Shniya never changed. So the fact that Kedusha Shniya, so he says, then you no longer need any verbal sort of ceremony of Kedusha, even for new territory. So he says, for example, we don't find that the Chashmonaim ever made a ceremony of sanctifying new land. Why not?
Because it was already from Ezra.
From Ezra, that even though Ezra only did a certain section, but that Kedusha Ezra that he did with the ceremony, that expands even to what the Chashmonaim are going to later conquer. And by Mela, that same Kedusha of Ezra, the ceremony can expand to what the army are going to do in 1967. And then he finishes off. In the section 101 of this tshuva, miyitain of his chus avos v'himois, we should go back to having the Beis Hamikdash and all the Eretz Yisrael with all the details and details as is destined to be. And I guess we can echo his prayers in saying Kenti Elanu that we should have Melech HaMashiach with the actual king and with the actual Sanhedrin and with an actual Beis Hamikdash and undisputed Kedusha in the entire region, Menahar Pras, from the river to the sea.
Amen.